Now we come to the second part, the ideological background behind the global sexual revolution. The decisive event was the student revolution of 1968 that seized the Western culture. I'm a witness of that time as a student of sociology at the Free University of West Berlin. I experienced the change from a culture that considered monogamy as the foundation of the family and protected it by law and social norms to a culture that legally sanctions people who hold on to the basic moral values that are the foundation of the family. What does the sexual liberation consist of? Satisfy your sexual drive in any way you want with a man or a woman or both, or even with children, which was promoted by the Green Party in the 1980s. Destroy the bourgeois institution of marriage. Promote sex with children. Teach them masturbation from kindergarten onwards, which is now the program of the United Nations and the sub-organizations and the European Union. Legalize pornography. Allow the entertainment industry to constantly stimulate the sexual drive of the viewers. Legalize the killing of the unborn child. The rebellious students of 1968 had absorbed the thinking of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. I will now go through the main trailblazers of make a few remarks on the main people who gave the ideas for the sexual revolution. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw the, quote, antagonism between man and woman as the first class conflict. Of course, this antagonism had to be overcome by demolishing the family. This they proclaimed in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Sigmund Freud described man as a slave of sexual suppression, which had to be overcome to get out of this slavery. The materialistic theory of Karl Marx and the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud merged and were the foundation of the so-called critical theory of the professors of the Frankfurter Schule, Frankfurt School of Philosophy, who formed the mind of the 68 generation. One of them was Herbert Marcuse, who promoted the message that sexual liberation, so-called liberation, would bring about the paradise of a society free of suppression. The hippie version of this message is make love, not war. Who can resist such a message? The students of the 68 generation put it into practice. They advertised so-called free love, that is group sex and sex with children, and they set out to destroy marriage and family. They realized that this could only be brought about by the long march through the institutions to the top positions of power in all areas of society. They succeeded. Simone de Beauvoir, partner of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, had an enormous influence on gender ideology. She said the famous sentence, "One is not born a woman, but becomes a woman," thus laying the seed of gender ideology. She also said, get out of the slavery of motherhood. Alfred Kinsey, still respected as the father of sexology, faked surveys and sexually abused babies for his research. By showing how many stimulated orgasms a baby could have in a few seconds or minutes, he wanted to prove to the world that children need to be introduced to sexual arousal and satisfaction. Kinsey was an extreme homosexual sadomasochist who boasted to have the largest pornography collection of the world. John Money, a psychiatrist of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, In the 1960s, Money opened the first clinic for sex reassignment surgery. His success was based on an experiment with two twin brothers, who at the end both committed suicide. No reason for Money to abstain from the mutilation of the human body. Money advocated group sex and sex for children. Michel Foucault, father of the philosophy of constructivism, the teacher of Judith Butler, intentionally deconstructed marriage and family. This was his agenda, 4 points. Separate the woman and sexuality from fertility, family, and child. Debase the model of marriage and family, promote sex amongst children and youth, remove taboos and normalize of all kind of perverse sexual practices and identities. As has come to light this year in the French media, Foucault had a very special sexual appetite. He was a pedophile who raped young boys on the tombstones of cemeteries. There's no limit to the abyss of sexual perversion. Michel Foucault was the teacher of Judith Butler. She was a rhetoric and philosophy professor at the University of California in Stanford. In 1990, she published her book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. As announced in the title, her aim was to deconstruct the identity of man and woman, to create so-called gender fluidity, and thus dissolve compulsory heterosexuality and so-called phallogocentrism. She claimed to do away with the taboo of incest. In Judith Butler's view, there is no masculine and feminine being, but only a certain performance that can be changed at any time. For Butler, a proclaimed lesbian herself, I said it already, the incest taboo is one cause of the so-called phantasma of gender identity of man and woman. It must therefore be abolished. All so-called signatures of the binary form of human existence as man and woman have to be wiped out. Judith Butler is a member of the Rockefeller and Guggenheim Foundation, which proves that the deconstruction of identity of man and woman is in line with their agenda. Judith Butler received highly endowed awards. In 2015, she received the honorary doctorate of the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. All of these intellectual trailblazers of the sexual revolution were atheistic, communist, anarchistic thinkers, and they are to the present day. If one looks at the personal life of these powerful thinkers, one usually finds an abyss of perversion and abuse. They use their intellectual power to adapt the world to their own sexual appetites, devoid of any moral limitations. The cultural skateboard, so to speak, into the social chaos created by so-called identity politics was feminism. There were very good reasons for a woman movement for equal rights. It was started more than 150 years ago by Catholic women who fought for the right to vote and have a bank account and similar normal entrances into the society. Women and men are equal in dignity and potential, but they are not the same. They are complementary in the biological, psychological, and spiritual level, and their ontological vocation. Women give life and nurture life by being mothers. men's primal vocation is to protect their wife and their children and their nation. What richness and joy if that complementarity is lived out in a good marriage. This is all what we long for, stable love. What a disaster if the differences are taken out on each other in a power struggle on the personal level or in society as a whole. The necessary movement for equal rights perverted when women began to fight for sexual self-determination, which meant to break the bond of marriage and the responsibility of children. It became possible through the availability of the pill and the legalization of abortion. Margaret Sanger invested her life in this battle. She founded the Eugenic American Birth Control League, the forerunner of the International Planned Parenthood Foundation, running the global abortion industry in our time, and being responsible for millions of the 50 million unborn children that are killed on this planet every year. At the beginning of this battle, abortion was legalized in certain defined cases. This year, 2021, on June the 23rd, the European Parliament accepted the so-called Matic report that claims abortion up to the ninth month, up to birth, as a human right. Where have we come to? The killing of the unborn child up to the time of birth, a human right? If there is a God who loves every single human creature, this will have sorrowful consequences for humanity. Gender ideology has used feminism, but at the same time destroys its basis. If there is no such thing as a sexual identity of man and woman, then the feminists fighting for supremacy of the women have a problem. If being a woman is irrelevant, why fight for quotas for women? Why then change your sex by lifelong dependence on hormones and the mutilation of your body if biological sex is irrelevant? Because you are what you claim to be? In the new stage of the transgender movement, we now see an open conflict between feminists and transgenderists. Women just don't want to compete in sports against men who say they are women, nor do they want to be raped by men dressing up as women, should they happen to become imprisoned. Cultural Marxism has captured the West and marches on, and it now enters the territory of South Korea. It marches against history, against reason, against science, against nature, against God. Since it is built on an anthropological lie, it must become totalitarian. The blueprint for the totalitarian remodeling of society, according to LGBT precepts, are the so-called Yogyakarta principles. The strategies of the cultural revolutionists are openly laid out. They are highly sophisticated, organized, and long-term. They make use of all methods of social engineering, especially the media and the entertainment industry. They reach for the highest levels of power in governments, international organizations, the legal system, academia. They infiltrate the Catholic Church as the main bulwark of resistance. They adapt their strategies to the specific conditions of every nation, culture, and religion. In 2007, so-called human rights experts met in the Indonesian town Yogyakarta and drew up these so-called 29 Yogyakarta principles. 10 years later, they were amended with another 100, quote, additional principles and state obligations on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics to complement the Yogyakarta principles, end of quote. You did hear that they demand this, put obligations on the state to put all that and implement all that in the legal system and in society. Many governments have endorsed these principles and committed themselves to their implementation. They are the blueprint for reshaping all areas of society according to the agenda of the LGBTIQ movement. The methods of implementation are hollowing out national sovereignty through treaty monitoring bodies of the United Nations, cooperating with local NGOs in the nation, supplying millions of financial resources from the UN, EU, and national governments for LGBTIQ organizations, enact court test cases at all levels of the legal system in the name of human rights and anti-discrimination, change the population's fundamental values by public demonstrations of so-called Christopher Street Days and portraying the homosexual and transgender lifestyle as normal and attractive, beginning in kindergarten, all through schools and universities and the media. To create social and legal sanctions against opposition, threatening their material and social existence. This is accompanied by a veritable so-called shitstorm in the social media. The higher the position of a person that dares to resist, the more brutal the campaign against them. The change of language is essential for brainwashing people without them even noticing, by inventing new concepts like gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, sexual expression, homophobia, diversity, and many more. These linguistic inventions, and their content were totally unknown to those who put down the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not even the dystopias of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell foresaw that in the third millennium, people would be able to choose from 60 or more sexual identities. The principles, the Yogyakarta principles, come with an activist guide to the Yogyakarta principles. The activist is supplied with concrete instructions how to change societies, adapting the strategy to their different social and legal standards. It is easy to form an activist group in any nation, train them, give them unlimited money and legal support for strategic litigation in order to change the culture according to LGBT principles, be it Western, Islamic, or traditional Africa. You can tick off in your own nation what has already been accomplished. But again, the question, was there a mass movement that demanded to be freed from the unbearable burden of being born as a man or woman and to choose one's gender? No, there wasn't. Was there a mass movement to give same-sex partnerships the legal status of marriage? No, there wasn't. There were mass demonstrations against it. Was there a mass movement for the artificial production of children, depriving them of their human right to be brought up by their biological parents? No, there are no such mass movements. The people of this world are subjected to a top-down revolution that is brought about, as I already said, by the elites of power and money, who make use of sexual minorities and call their demands human rights. The visible objective of this revolution is the reduction of world population.